Okay, now maybe we can turn to the war years.
Okay, so the war broke out in 1939, but Hungary did not join the war effort until 42. Although Horthy, the regent of Hungary, was on the Hitler side, he was trying to get away without entering the war. So he appeased Hitler, bringing in more and more stringent Jewish laws. But he refused to deport the Jews from Hungary. So felt relatively safe. And then, actually, at 42, we were forced into entering the war. And that's when my father left.
Do you remember?
the-
Do you remember conversations that your parents had?
No, no, I was too young for that. And all I know that we had a radio in the central hall of the apartment where no neighbor was able to hear us. And that's where we were listening to the BBC, the famous ta 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 tam. And I remember my grandfather and everybody was turning like this to the radio, trying to, because it was a lot of disturbance and everything. That's all I remember.
But there was Hungarian radio. You just knew that it would be misinformation.
That was coming from, that was the BBC Hungarian broadcast.
So it was in Hungarian.
Yes, it was in Hungary.
Okay.
Yes. And I remember that after 42, we had raids, and we had to go down in the middle of the night. We had to go down to the bunkers.
What does that mean, raids?
Bombing raids. As far as I know, the bombing raids were, at night were from the Americans, but I'm not sure. I read it much later that it wasn't the British, it was the American. Until all I remember that my father left, and there was less and less good food on the table. But there was food, but less and less
Your mother,
elegant good food.
your mother went out and got groceries the best
Oh
she
yeah,
could.
it was a relatively peaceful life. We still had the maid for a while, and then because of the Jewish laws, we were not allowed to hire someone who was an Aryan, and she had to leave. I do remember that. She was crying.
What was her name?
Mariska.
Mariska. Were you using ration cards or was it money still?
I don't remember
Okay.
that. I don't remember how it was. But it was a relatively peaceful life until the Germans occupied Hungary, when it was quite evident that Horthy was trying to negotiate with London and also with Moscow, was trying to get out of the war. Then Hitler decided to occupy Hungary, and that's when the Hungarian Holocaust started.
When you spoke of going, there would be air raid sirens. How did you know that there was a raid?
But the sirens.
The sirens
and
went.
then we knew we had to go down to
Then
the bunker.
And everyone in the building went.
Everybody in the building went down. The janitor sent up the elevator for my grandfather, who had trouble walking. It was all arranged, and we were all in the bunkers, the whole building. Yeah.
And it was a mix of Jewish people.
No,
and
no,
it was
no,
all
no,
Jewish.
No, not in our. We had a condominium building, and there was no problem there, not at all. After March 1944, which of course I can never forget that date, when the Germans marched into Budapest and to Hungary. That I remember.
Did you-
I remember the marching on the street, and from then on there were very strict Jewish laws.
Did you actually see the soldiers?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
From your window or?
I don't remember how,
Okay.
but I do remember I saw them. Then the law came that Jews after over 6 years old has to wear the yellow star. I was not 6 years old at that time and was utterly jealous of Aniko and Clary because they had such a beautiful star. And I couldn't understand why they were covering it with a copybook. This is very personal
Mm-hmm.
remembrance. And then later on, maybe I think it was in June, we had to go to the Jewish houses. That was a designated house in the district.
So not that far from where you were?
You could actually see it right across on the street. They decided to have it a Jewish building. I have no idea why, because I later met people who originally lived there. They were not Jewish. So we moved there, and it was a very crowded existence. My grandparents were moving in with us.
Which grandparents?
My mother's,
Parents.
my mother's, and Clary's mother and Clary moved in with us. I did not mention that the day after the Germans walked in, we had a very, very close family friend, a couple. The husband was Jewish and the wife was an Austrian Christian. And she came over and took us, Aniko and myself, to the little town where my uncle was a doctor.
What was the name of the town? Do you remember?
Sörliget.
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 Okay.
Of course I remember. And by the time we got there, on the 20th of March, my uncle was already taken by the Germans. I have no idea why she took us there. She felt that we will be safer in the village, but anyway, it was not a successful trip. But anyway, my aunt, Clary's mother, and Clary came with us to live. So it was a very crowded existence, but being 6 years old, it really didn't bother me. As a matter of fact, I have very good memory of that time. There were a lot of 20-some-year-old women. One of them was my aunt, Marta, who decided that something has to be done with the children. And so organized, for the older one, a school. For us, it just organized playing, and tell you the truth, we had a ball
Mm-hmm.
as a 6-year-old.
Do you remember anything about your sister during this time?
Yes, she was one of the. She was also being in the group, an older group, of course, not mine. But for example, there was on the top of the building there was a wedding for everybody, and I married another 6-year-old guy whose name was Webberger Gabor.
Already the
And-
Gabors.
Yeah, it looks like I'm partial to Gabors. So that was the Jewish house. A few weeks later, a priest came in and offered to baptize whoever willing to do. They were hoping that by baptizing us to Catholicism, then we will be saved. It was a last minute effort, and so we were baptized.
And they gave you the documentation.
Yes, it's on my. Unfortunately, I lost it, but it was on my birth certificate. In Hungarian birth certificate, your religion is indicated, but on top of it, they wrote that I changed my religion to Catholic. But because I was 6 years old, I have a choice at age 18 to choose. So this is just about the Jewish house. I can say, of course, the grown-ups must have felt a little bit more worried than myself.
Did everybody have their own beds? How did that work?
We were crowded, but I don't remember being. But as a 6 years old, you don't feel. I am sure everybody was trying to make it the most comfortable for the children.
Right.
Yeah. So that was during the summer. Now everything changed in October the 15th, when Horthy was replaced with a very, very fascist Hungarian government, which was the Arrow Cross. Arrow Cross is the SS of the Hungarian SS. The Arrow Cross party took over, and that's when the real trouble started for the Jews of Budapest. What we didn't really know, that during April and May and the first 2 weeks of June, all the Jews outside of Budapest, in villages and small towns, were deported to Auschwitz. That's where the bulk of my family from Miskolc and Szeged, they were deported to. They were deported to Auschwitz.
So you still only had occasional radio that you would listen.
That we didn't know anything about.
Okay.
No.
No, but
At least I didn't know anything about.
But the news, there was no real communication.
There was no. Well, we had to give in our radio, first of all. And also we had to leave all our furniture, everything, when we moved to the Jewish house. And our janitor offered to hide everything in the basement, which he did. So after October 15th, that's when the aforementioned Austrian woman came and took me away, because she heard that they are going to take the children from the Jewish houses to deport. So she took me away. I went through, with her, I went through a razzia, or how do you say that, when the German soldiers are asking your papers and so on, and I had no paper whatsoever.
Right. Checkpoint.
And I had no paper. I was hiding as a Transylvanian refugee child. Fortunately, at that time as a child, I did not look Jewish at all. So, and she was an Austrian woman. She was talking to them in German, and we had no problem. But I do remember going through the checkpoint. And from then on, I was basically alone for a while. When it was too difficult to hide me in certain places, I moved 23 times. I mean,
Were you
Right,
were you afraid?
I don't remember being afraid at that time.
But you were
I
given
have
very clear instructions on
I
what
was
to.
given very clear instructions that I never ever have to can say that I am Kati Gunzi. I always have to say I am Kati Kish, and I'm coming from Transylvania. And I knew that.
Hmm.
I learned that, and that was no question about it. But when it was starting to be very difficult to place me different places, I was, and my sister by that time
So
was,
you weren't with your sister during
no,
these,
I was alone at that.
but you moved 23 times in how long?
In a few months.
In a few
In
months,
a
okay.
few months.
But you were also always with this Austrian lady?
I was then by November I was taken to the convent and my sister joined me. I have to mention that while I was hiding all over Budapest, my sister and my mother were taken to a brick factory where that was well known that in the brick factory they that was like a waiting point to take them to the wagons to take them. And my mother and my sister escaped.
Do you know how they escaped?
Yes, my mother said to Aniko, I am going to lean on you and we are going to walk out of here and you are going to say that I am sick and I cannot walk. And they did that. And they did that and they actually walked out. And then after my mother ran back and pulled out my aunt and my grandmother. I think the aerocross guy who was there didn't didn't want to cause trouble. It sounds almost bizarre, but this is exactly how it happened.
So although he was in the Aerocross, he was sympathetic
Yeah.
too.
So by that time, so anyway, we went to the convent where everybody was Jewish. All the girls were Jewish, and really, I have to say that at that time the Catholic Church really was trying to save us. My most memorable incident in that convent was when we were playing and they called us in to go to the Mother Superior. They had a huge big office and we walked there and thinking, what did we do wrong that we are going to be called there? And we walked in and she was smiling and there were two men standing there. I had no idea who they were. And all of a sudden I saw my sister yell and run to one of the men and kissed him. And that's how I learned that he was my father. And so by that time my father came back.
From the labor camp.
He escaped and came back from the labor camp. And so I learned that he was my father, and then unfortunately the Aerocross got wind of the fact that the convents were hiding Jews, and they had to let us go.
How long?
I don't know exactly, but quite a few weeks because it was time to have First Communion for us, and we had time once to escape. My sister wanted to escape, so we did, and then my mother brought us back.
So you went back to your mother's.
Oh God, yes. But my poor mother was hiding somewhere, and we arrived. She wasn't happy.
It must have been amazed that you even found her.
Yeah, it's a story. So when the convent was dissolved, well, not the convent, but our hiding place, then I was hiding with my father. That's when I was hiding with my father. By that time, it was December. It was December, and we were in a empty apartment uh, on the top floor, and it was a office of the company where my father was working before the war. This is where I really learned to uh, be with my father again, because don't forget, he left when I was 4 years old, so I really don't remember too much. So
Was he skinnier? Like, did people talk about that he had changed?
I don't know whether
Okay.
he didn't look very well.
Yeah.
He looked very tired, and but he was wearing civilian clothes at that time. And by that time, the bombing and the air raids were very, very constant. Don't forget, the Russians by December were actually surrounding Budapest. Okay? So, first we thought we are hearing uh, bombs, when we realized they were not bombs, they were tanks already. The Russian tanks were closing in all around Budapest. But still, the Arrow Cross, not even as much the Germans as the Arrow Cross, they were taking people to the Danube, side of the Danube, and shot them into the river.
Was your family aware that this?
By that time, they must have known more
Okay.
than I did. Let's put it this way, okay? But I must have, because children don't know exactly what's happening, but they know. They know. They told me to hide, so I have to hide. Yeah. And so there I was, and the bombing was more and more constant. When my mother was there visiting and making langos, if you know what is langos,
Yes.
in a stove, in a wood stove. And I started to cry that I'm very hungry and please stop doing it and let's go and eat. And I was really whining like a 6-year-old. So my mother sort of dropped everything and said, heck with it, let's go and eat. And we went into the room, not on the other side of the apartment. And a minute later, a bomb fell, and the whole side where she was cooking disappeared. And so that was the first bomb.
That must have been terribly traumatic.
Yeah, it was not very pleasant, let's put it this way.
But the sound,
Okay?
the sound must
The
have been.
sound was terrible, and everybody became like a chalk. You couldn't recognize people. We were all totally white from the sand. I don't know what it is.
From the plaster.
From the plaster.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one memory of that, we were on the 3rd floor. My mother said to my aunt, "Put Kati out to the balcony." And my aunt said, "I don't see if we have a balcony." And she put me down. Well, apparently there was a balcony.
Before they bombed.
So we got ourselves somehow down the staircase and started running to another apartment building. My father was carrying me. And then few minutes later, we were bombed of that building also. So we drove to another one, not drove, but run to another one, and finally ended up in a basement. And by that time, we had no choice. We had to go down to the bunkers where people lived, and the bomb fell on that building also. And by that time, we were all white and unrecognizable. So it was perfectly all right to be there. No one asked questions anymore. So that was my lovely experience with bombs. And from then on, I was hiding with an old school friend of my mother. I don't know why I got there and how I got there. They took me in. They took me in and they were very nice. They took me in. By that time, everybody was in the bunker all the time because that was the siege of Budapest when the Russian soldiers were going from street to street fighting.
So it was very crowded in
It was
in
very crowded. It was terrible.
and
It
very
was
stuffy.
that I remember being terrible.
And did
It
people
was
have
crowded.
food
We
and
had no
toilets?
We had no food. We had no proper water. We had nothing. The people were sleeping on the floor. Actually, I have one experience. I got up to go to the bucket, and I stepped over someone who woke up and said, "Who is it?" And I was sleepy, and I said, "Kati Gunci." "Who is that?" I said, "Oh, that's my friend. I am Kati Kish." So I realized it right away, but that was not a good experience.
So it must have smelled terrible down there.
Well, I am sure I must.
No, but with the buckets.
Everybody felt terrible by then, whether you were Jewish or not Jewish. It was terrible. That was a siege.
Yes.
And on the street there were dead horses, and people went out when it was a little bit quiet to cut the meat out and bring it in. I mean, those were real terrible
Mm-hmm.
situations. But as a 6-year-old, you don't really register everything as terrible as that.
Did you ever speak to your sister later in life about her
Yes.
her view of this? Do you remember what her perspective is? And But
She was hiding somewhere else with my mother, and she was 10 years old, 10 years old at that time, so she was much older than me. At that time, 4 years is a lot.
oh, absolutely.
And she had far more understanding of the whole thing. And so it left bigger emotional scars on her than in me.
I can understand.
Some of it is personality, but some of it is because she was older. Yeah. And by that time, my father was working with that group who were wearing Aerocross uniform.
A resistance group.
A resistance group. They were, and he was able to bring flour and help a little bit. He even delivered flour to the place where I was. And then my good experience in that bunker was that all of a sudden a Russian soldier appeared. Well, you could see who's Russian, who's German from the uniform, yeah? And I was lying down, and she looked over me and looked and looked and looked, and I was told later that everybody was worried. What is he doing? And then he lifted me up, kissed me in a Russian style on both, and said, Devushka, Devushka, and told in German to the crowd that she has a daughter of that age at home. And that was it. A few hours later, he came back and brought a bag of sugar cubes, which was more precious than a bag of gold at that time. And a kerchief, a silk kerchief. Who knows where he stole it, but and gave it to me. So that was my nice experience.
Do you remember approximately when this was? In January? Or?
That was, well, yes. Pest was liberated September 17th. And so it must have been either 15 or 16. Unfortunately, on the 15th, my father was in a building that was hit by a bomb, and he was fatally injured. So,
But you told me previously how your mother had to go and find him
yes,
as well. You can describe.
after Pest was liberated, but that was only Pest. Buda was liberated only in the middle of February. The Germans were blockaded themselves into the castle on top and were fighting for 2 more weeks, 2 more months. So my father was taken to the emergency place, not a hospital, but a makeshift emergency place. And when he didn't show up after the 17th, when people started to come out of the bunkers, my mother started to look. And she went from place to place, and finally she got to the place where he was, and the doctor said, I did not let him I did not let them to take him because I knew someone will come for him.